we'll have Ann introduce Walter Hang.
Actually, I'm going to allow Walter to introduce himself. So,
greetings. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm Walter Hang, and I am the president of Toxics Targeting. We're an environmental database firm right here in Ithaca. I've worked with so many of you over the last 9 years. I've known some of the people in this room for 40 years, including Richard Lippis. So it's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to talk about basically how we can begin to enforce the U.S. Clean Water Act. So I'm going to talk to you about what I've been doing on shale fracking, on fossil fuel infrastructure, what I've been doing on toxic cleanup activities. And if you have a body of water that is impaired with harmful algal blooms, toxic chemicals, you can use the information I'm going to share today to basically try to remediate those water pollution problems. So 50 years ago this year, I was at the first Earth Day along with Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and he signed something or other, and I thought he cleaned up the environment. I was very moved. I was 15 at the time. Next slide. So here I am taking my only field biology course, and how time flies, Tempest Fusion. Next slide. So I was a low cancer researcher at Roswell Park in Buffalo, America's oldest cancer research institute, and I was going to cure cancer in one summer. And instead, I killed every single one of my patients, ages 6 months to 4.5 years old, with chemotherapy. And I realized I had made a terrible error in picking my occupation. And so I went to see my boss, Bob Hughes. I said, Bob, what does our work really have to do with curing cancer? And he said, about as much as the Indianapolis 500. And I got so depressed. It was a Wednesday, it was seminar day. I went to hide in the library. And there I saw the map that changed my life.
oh, sorry.
And this is basically the infamous Cancer Atlas. And you can see that the areas with cancer in the top 10% of the nation's overall rate are the industrialized areas. And I looked at this map and I said to myself, it has to be something in the environment. And if we can prevent the public's exposure to the causes of cancer, then they won't get it as much, then we won't have to treat it or cure it, neither of which we can do anyway, and that is true to this very day. And I didn't realize the politics that were underpinning these debates. Next slide. So basically my little niche was I would get, through freedom of information, all of the, for example, toxic wastewater discharges for the entire Hudson River drainage basin. And I showed that the Clean Water Act was wonderful, it was very rigorous, very demanding, it simply wasn't being enforced. And then in the beginning I did the studies, and then over the course of 12 years, I realized that there was a huge political component to these discussions. And so I basically transitioned to becoming a political fixer, and my little specialty is I can get press coverage, including getting on 60 Minutes twice, all the network news programs, Nightline, you name it. Next slide. So here I am in my youth, in my only blue suit with Donald Ross, who pretty much told me everything that I know. Next slide.
Oh.
So what toxics targeting does is we basically manage data for 850,000 known and potential toxic sites. And so what my company does is we take that local, state, and federal government data, we have a geographic information system, we map and we profile the sites and we can analyze them. Next slide. So this is the biggest litigation support project my firm was ever involved with. This is southeastern Queens. Next slide. And so you can see I mapped and profiled all these different sites. This is a site remediation boundary. And with my data, the city of New York sued ExxonMobil and won $104.7 million. If I referred that matter, I could have gotten a third if I were an attorney. That's why all of you should stay in law school. Next slide. So here are all of the impaired water bodies in red that are on 303D, the National Registry of Impaired Waters. And so this is the Marcellus Shale Formation. So I'm going to show you how we did a lot of work to try to battle shale fracking. Next slide.
Oh, Cuca Lake.
So basically, this is fracking. You can see the impoundment where they have fracking wastewater. This is the equipment. Next slide. The state's depiction of a clean, tightly regulated natural gas industry just got shot amok in the eye. So what I basically did was challenge the state's assertion that the existing regs are fine. We just needed a supplemental generic environmental impact statement, they were good to go. Next slide. So I documented 270 huge fires, explosions, massive wastewater discharges that were never cleaned up to the applicable standards. The governor, David Patterson, did not respond to my respectful letter, and as a result, I converted it into a coalition letter that ultimately got 10,000 signatories, including many of you in this room. The most important thing is I got huge press coverage. Next slide. So I found a guy not very far from here in Ithaca, and his water would catch on fire if you held a match to it. Next slide, Frederick Mayer. I found that the state had never cleaned up and properly abandoned thousands and thousands of ancient oil and gas wells. Next slide. And then we basically would just beat the governor like a gong until he basically did what we requested. Next slide. Which was to prohibit shale fracking in New York State and not allow it anywhere. We're the only state who actually has a lot of shale and it's not being fracked at all. Just this morning I heard on NPR that there are 55,000 production wells, oil and gas production wells in northern Colorado. And so this amazing victory is because of people like you in this room and thousands of other people who I found were very coachable. And we basically pressured the governor into making sure that shale fracking was not allowed to this very day. Thanks. Next slide. So the background is that I developed this technique of looking at the data, understanding the law in a fight on Cayuga Lake. And so this involves pulling up very cold water from the bottom of the lake, 250 feet deep, just south of the yacht club. But an energetic group of local opponents insist that Cornell's $55 million plan to replace its aging air conditioners is actually an environmental nightmare. They say it could foster choking blooms of algae and bacteria at the south end of the lake, and that's exactly true. That's exactly what happened. Next slide. So I hired a young scientist named Marshall Ballard, and I began to organize local citizens, and Marshall walked 26 miles of impaired tributaries, and everywhere he found a source of pollution, he mapped it and we profiled it. Next slide. And so this is a wonderful memo from Natural Resources Defense Council. So even though Peter Lehner's name is on it, it was actually drafted by a woman named Hope Moore, who couldn't decide whether she wanted to be a ballerina or an attorney. But thank God she drafted this memo. So it basically said, this means, in essence, that Cayuga Lake already is subject to concentrations of discharges of silt nutrition in excessive amounts and will allow it to be clean enough for its designated use. It was polluted. Next slide. And so it says, EPA's TMDL, Total Maximum Daily Load Regulations, implementing Section 303D, prohibit the issuance of permits to, quote, a new source or a new discharger if the discharge from its construction operation will cause or contribute to the violation of water quality standards, close quote. And so the water quality standards for phosphorus and silt are extremely strict. None in amounts that will result in algae, weeds, and slimes that will impair the waters for their best use. The same thing basically for silt. So this discharge, no matter how wonderful it is from an energy perspective, never should have been granted. Next slide. And that's what it basically say. Maybe an aggressive program to reduce these discharges could result in sufficient improvement to justify delisting the lake in the future, unless and until these actions are taken, the southern portion of the lake is delisted, the moratorium on new sources remains the legal mandate. So the law was very, very strong. Guess what? It wasn't enforced. Next slide. So I started getting these wonderful anonymous letters written with the person's wrong hand. And it said, number one, EPA gave DC $50,000 to begin to develop the total maximum daily load. This is a comprehensive watershed cleanup. And they didn't want to take it. Then it basically said, apparently the 303D listing for Cayuga Lake will be revisited within the near future. future, it is not certain that South Lake will remain on the list. That was a very important regulatory decision. Next slide. And so basically, we found out that Cornell and the state and the feds were negotiating, and they were cutting out the citizens. I tell this to you because trust no one. They will lie. They will hide. I hate to be such a downer, but it is the reality. We're not hiding anything from the public in our review process, said Mary Mears, an EPA spokeswoman, August 7th. Next slide. So, this is Phil DeGaetano, non-point source pollution for DEC. Kathy would like your comments by tomorrow, July 22nd.
Yeah.
The public have been totally cut out. Next slide. This is Hal Craft for Cornell. Same thing. They were negotiating in secret without any kind of public input. I believe that's improper. Next slide. This afternoon, I spoke to NG Call regarding meeting with DEC, EPA, Cornell citizens. Call said he did not want to speak with Walter, or meet with Walter at this time. He thought that you and he agreed to meet with Cornell and the two agencies first, then meet with the citizens when we have something to tell them about future non-point source programs. I then called Walter Hogg. I got his machine. I left a message. We will be getting back to him with a response. No matter how paranoid I am, I'm not paranoid enough. Next slide. So it was the development of explicit criteria to determine if lake source cooling is causing adverse impacts, completion of an alpha relocation study. You had to send the phosphorus off the shelf back down to the bottom of the lake where it's cold and dark, no algae. And this is the heartbreaker. Development and implementation of projects to reduce diffuse loadings of phosphorus to the lake. So they wanted to require Cornell to clean up twice as much pollution in the watershed as it was dumping. Next slide. So now it's a criteria, conduct a study, identify the role. Next slide. And then it just got chopped to pieces, was never adopted. This would have been a landmark historic document. Next slide. There was no protocol where non-point sources of pollution reductions are being used for an effect for any project in the community, so there was no consensus that doing it for lake source cooling was the right thing to do. And this is where Lanny Joyce from Cornell, he admitted, he said this, the 5 to 6% increase he meant in phosphorus had been discussed since 1995. So this violated the key provision of law 122.4 paren I. You can't add more shit. Buying a little bit of land and thanking the governor just isn't going to do it. Next slide. So last summer I documented agricultural manure spills. Next slide. This is what they look like. These are the impoundments. Big rain, they flood. Next slide. They spray staggering quantities of liquid manure on the fields, like up to 750,000 gallons in one application. Next slide. So then I documented these problems. During investigation of fish kills, Sheen noticed on water and stream that flows into the Black River. Future investigation found the manure lagoon had breached and released 7 to 10 million gallons. That, as they say, is a shitload. Next slide. Here's 75,000 gallons. Warm weather caused melting and manure runoff. Went into ditch. You know, so you get the idea. It's just going on all the time. Next slide. Here's another one, 17,500. They're never cleaned up. They just go into the bodies of water and they contribute to the problem. Why? Phosphorus is essentially growth limiting in these aquatic ecosystems for fresh water. You add more phosphorus, you get more algae and weeds. Also, if you add more nitrogen, you add all kinds of nutrients, you basically promote the growth of these algae and weeds. Next slide. So last year we had more harmful algal blooms documented in New York than ever before, all over the state of New York. Next slide. And here's the amazing thing. Cornell, in their EIS, actually documented that cyanobacteria are more prevalent in warm water months. That's when the air conditioning system is going full tilt. And that's how come once you get these blooms, then the cells die, they release the nutrients, and it just happens over and over and over again until the water gets too cold. Next slide. So there's Bolton Point, and this is where the plume is. It goes right over the intake to the drinking water supply to 3,000 people. Next slide. So if you look at toxicstargeting.com, check 303D, the only bodies of water that are going to get TMDLs this year, Honeoye, Canisius, and Hugo Lake. And so basically we're fighting to make sure that there's comprehensive cleanup, and I want to show you now how that can be achieved right here in Little Ithaca. So you can see all these toxic sites. Next slide. So these are sins of the past. Toxics targeting gets just an incredible amount of press. That's what drives the powers that be. Next slide. Here's a trailer park directly on top of a toxic dump. There's Wegmans. Next slide. This is all the contamination was never cleaned up. Next slide. You can still see barrels sticking out of this landfill and right next to Wegmans. Next slide. There are the trailer parks. You can see it's leaking into an inlet. This drains right into the lake. Next slide. So I don't want you to be down now. It shows you how when people work together, you can achieve amazing cleanup. So this is West Court Street. That's 120 feet long, 60 feet wide. Before there was natural gas, there was manufactured gas. It was produced in that retort building. They heated coal in the absence of oxygen, and it cooked out the gas as well as coal tar. Next slide. So the equipment drove in, this big air handling. They dug down to 15 feet below grade. Next slide. They drove sheet pile 53 feet below grade and dug out the pollution. You can see it. There's a giant pneumatic hammer. You can see they dragged around this front structure. Next slide. They dug it out. Next slide. And there you have it. That house is gone. Now there's a ball field. Next slide. Whole new road, new utilities. So we need to work together. If you try to do it on your own, if you try to figure it out, you're dead. If you join the efforts with more than 1,500 entities that are signatories to our coalition letter, more than 100 groups, we can prevail. The governor is looking at brutal pressure. Segos, I believe, got booted, and then I think the governor couldn't get anyone to take his spot, so he came back. So I'm launching my campaign for this summer today on harmful lagoons for equality. If anyone can help me on Cornell, we can't let them argue that dilution is the solution to pollution. We have to make them fulfill their legal requirement. They can't be allowed to discharge into that impaired segment. And so on final note, we're going to be working on fossil fuel infrastructure. We're going to reduce demand, I believe, by as much as a third. And then also we're going to try to make sure that we deal with these legacy toxic sites. That one in Elmira, it's a 100-year-old site, never cleaned up. You can go to toxicstargeting.com, click on the Home Buyer Beware map, type in your address. You're going to be shocked at how many sites haven't been cleaned up, how many impaired water bodies there are. If you value your community, you value your property, you value your health, we have to work together. We've proven that we can succeed. We just have to kick it up to the next quantum level. Thank you so much.